Marcel, welcome to the show. How you doing, my man?
I'm doing great when I'm with you, Greg. Thanks for having me.
Yes, I'm super stoked. So, guys, like I mentioned, we're speaking with Marcel here, and he runs a company called Parakeeto. We met, it was in your hometown
Mountain
with Dan
Brunswick.
Martell.
Yes.
Yeah,
For
with Dan
boardroom. That
Martell.
must have been, what, 2018?
It was pre him doing anything SaaS Academy when he coached all of us other entrepreneurs. But I'm super stoked because since then, you've evolved a lot. And you're focused heavily on helping agencies and service providers be more profitable. I know is a topic that with our clients, we talk a lot about, and even prospects like coming in, everyone's obviously focused on top line revenue. And the number of times I've spoken to people that have really amazing top line revenue, little to find out that they're like barely breaking even and or losing money is shockingly high. I think it's extremely common in service-based businesses, and especially the early stage of agencies when they're really trying to start as the owner, trying to delegate. And so I really want to kind of have you break down a lot of your findings. For most people, it's like they probably, even with your business, I kind of want to understand kind of the evolution because like it's not a sexy topic despite everyone wanting profit, right? Like, oh, let's talk about money. It's not the same thing as lead gen, right? But yet the smart entrepreneurs are focusing on it. So can you quickly do your intro, explain a little bit about Parakeeto to kind of set the context, and then maybe like what are the top 3 mistakes people are making or causing to lack of profitability?
Yes, absolutely. So, and to your point, I'm at an event right now speaking, which hence like the jungle background and the low quality video and audio. But I said this today where there was like these 2 speakers. There was me, and then there was this other guy that was talking about like creativity. And I'm in a room full of creative agencies. And so I alluded to the fact that it's hard being a broccoli salesman competing against chocolate salespeople. Like I'm out here peddling my broccoli. And yeah, everybody knows they have to be profitable. But the reality of what it means to do that is not very sexy. It takes a lot of diligent work, but it's not complicated. It's simple, but it's not easy. So with that, yeah, Parakeeto, we basically help agencies install systems to help them measure their profitability. And then we coach them through actually taking action in the business to make the business more successful. And the thing I say all the time is most agencies are not suffering from starvation. They're suffering from indigestion. They just happen to feel the same. And so, as you mentioned, right, agencies doing millions of dollars in revenue, there's not a lack of opportunity to be profitable there, but there is something going on in the operations of the business that are undermining the ability for that business to return a bottom line to the founders that are presumably working long hours, investing a lot of time and energy and opportunity costs to build that business. So that's really where we specialize. And I think what's important to note is that historically, finance has been seen as the department that is responsible for doing this. And I think what's happened in the agency world over the last couple of decades is because there's all this downward pressure on margins, it's coming from both sides, right? We all know people want to get paid more than they've ever gotten paid. And we can't get away with asking them to work 100-hour weeks, like, back in the old agency days where that was just kind of how it worked. You got paid like shit, you worked a ton of hours, and then one day you would graduate to working for the brand side.
Right.
That's not how agencies work anymore. People want work-life balance. All of these things are reasonable, right? I'm saying this like it's a bad thing. It's a good thing, but it's forcing agencies to get better at operations. And conversely, you're seeing like geographical borders don't really exist anymore. So you're competing against agencies all over the world that can charge a lot less than you. The full service agency is kind of eroding. So people are having to specialize, get more specific. And this has led to a much higher level of complexity in the business model of a small agency. There was a time when it was just time materials, long agency of record type engagements. And that time materials model, it's very well supported by the thought leadership, the financial models, the software that has been built over the last 30 years. But now we've seen this quick movement to these much more complex and nuanced business models that are incompatible with a lot of the old ways of thinking. And what that's requiring is that, yes, you need good finances, you need good books. That's table stakes now. Now you need to be able to quickly identify very precise insights about the business. What are our most or least profitable clients, projects, service lines, product types, departments, right? What's our utilization look like sliced in these different ways? And we have to get into operations data to do that. That's your project and time tracking data. And how is that structured? And how does that whole system work to return these insights to you much quicker than your books that are showing up 3 weeks after the month is closed looking backwards? And that's the gap that we fill is like, your finance team is probably way out of their wheelhouse when you start pulling them into timesheets and stuff like that. But that's the zone that we come in to fill is like, we got to get that part right once you get the basics in place, which is finance. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, but that's essentially what we do and where we specialize.
I love it. And so before we kind of jump into actual, and maybe this will be a transition, but you said something that really is interesting. Like, well, you said a lot of things that like, get me going with me leaving agency and then creating what is now alt agency kind of plays into that concept where you're talking about, or I guess not concept, but observation of full service agency is eroding. Obviously, all these different factors of things like, overseas talent. But not only that, I just made a video the other day. It's not live yet, basically saying the lines between what many of us know as a traditional agency and say like a consultancy are more blurry than they've ever been. Not only that, you throw in the rise of like e-learning, and this is kind of where I saw the writing on the wall. It's like, well, as an agency, you have expertise, and you mentioned product lines or service lines. It's like, well, why can't and why shouldn't an agency have a service line that is e-learning, that is training, that is courses versus just, the done for you things that we all know and, grew up understanding as an agency. And so does that also, well, one, I know from our experience that obviously helps having lines like that aren't directly tied to only labor, increase profitability. But I guess at the same time, to your point, as you add some of these other service lines, again, doing it the right way, I guess, like it probably does make tracking all of this actually still harder because you're utilizing people across different service lines and things like that.
Yeah.
Is that accurate?
Yeah. So, and we'll get into the conversation of, what exactly does profitability mean for a service company, and how do these
Yeah.
things like more legitimately productized courses and material and thought leadership play into that. And to your point, complexity is the enemy of scale. And that's true about business models. And then especially when you get into reporting systems, like, yes, all of this operational drag, it adds up very, very, very quickly. And that's true about adding complexity to the business model. And so is the answer to your profitability problem trying to democratize your thought leadership into, well, maybe, maybe not. The way that I would frame that is, what problem do you solve? And I think that's the thing that most people are missing when they start thinking about all of the tactics and mechanics of niching and productization versus value-based pricing. Like, there's all these tactics out there and all of them are very useful, but they're only useful in the context of what problem are we solving for the industry, and do these help us serve solving that problem? And that's then the secondary question is, okay, well, what are the right services? What is the right business model? What is the right pricing model? What are the tactical elements that allow us to solve this problem better than anyone else? And it's that focus on the problem that I think allows us to be more deliberate about what kind of complexity we want to add to the business and keeping that in balance as we scale. And the other thing that undermines this a lot as well is everyone's desire to be precise and conflating that with accuracy. And as well as I do, like, on time tracking, for example, it's like, well, if I'm pushing my team to be 99% accurate and track things down to the minute, is that helping me if now all of a sudden half of their time is getting to the time tracking tool, as opposed to the other end, which is they get 100% of it in, but it's maybe only 80% accurate? Which one's better? Well, obviously the latter is better. Accuracy is really what we're gunning for, but we conflate precision with accuracy, and precision creates a lot of operational drag. And most of the time when I start working with bigger clients, 50, 100 employees, their problem is they've added too much precision to their model, and now it's holding them back from actually being able to run it. So it's an addition by subtraction. So anyway, that was a long rant, but we'll talk a little bit more. I'll let you take it from here and direct it.
Yeah. Oh man, this is just so powerful. I split my notes into 9 boxes and I already have 6 of them full. So I'm like, oh God, this is good. Let's kick it off. Like, this sounds like almost it's like a dumb question, but like, define profitability.
Yeah, great question. So there are 2, I think, important measures of profitability when you talk about services. And let's qualify services by anything that requires skilled labor to deliver an outcome to a client. So whether you're selling lawn care services or websites or funnels or accounting, whatever, if you need skilled labor in order to get that thing done, then you are selling a service, which is different than a product where your cost is fixed. And that's the defining characteristic of a service. And I think the reason why we need to treat it differently is your cost is not always the same. It changes based on how much time is required from that skilled labor to get it done. And it usually will vary to some extent from one service to another, unless you have mechanics, like, for example, agreeing to a flat rate with a white label partner to then lock that in which case you've truly productized the service. But otherwise, there's variability, and we need to account for that variability. So with that in mind, most people are focused on bottom line profit. Usually we're looking at that in terms of EBITDA. And that's the ultimate goal of a business, is to have a strong EBITDA, of course. But the mistake that most people make is that's the only number that they focus on. And what they're not measuring is what I call delivery margin, what your accountant might call gross margin or contribution margin. And that to me is the most important metric for a service business, because if that's not right, then the EBITDA is going to be hard to achieve. And you might spend a lot of time trying to optimize for EBITDA in the wrong places because you can't see what the actual problem is. So let's talk about that for a second. What
Yeah.
is delivery margin or gross margin? And really what that is, it's a measure of how fundamentally profitable is the service offering. Or in other terms, what does it cost us to earn a dollar of revenue? And that's a bit of a foreign concept for people, but you think about it as a service provider. Let's say I sold you a website, Greg. You might give me 50% of that money up front. If I haven't lifted a finger or done any work, does that money really belong to me? That goes on the balance sheet as deferred revenue. It's basically a liability until I've actually completed the amount of work that in the contract says, well, now that money belongs to me. But
Right.
agency owners are focused on the cash, right? I got $50,000 for this $100,000 website up front. So like I made $50,000. Well, it's like, no, actually you have to now earn that revenue by achieving the milestones in the contract. And that is going to cost you money. And how much money it's going to cost you depends on how much time it takes. So we need to measure that piece. What did it cost you to earn this? And that comes from isolating what I call delivery costs. And for most of you listening, if you pull up your P&L while you're listening to this and you look at it, I'm willing to bet, because we've looked at a lot of P&Ls for agencies, there's two lines, payroll and software, and everything for the whole company goes into that one line. What needs to happen for most of you in order to understand what it's costing you to deliver to clients is payroll needs to get split up into at least two categories, but ideally three, but two categories being delivery payroll and then your overhead payroll. So delivery payroll would be how much of your payroll goes to the people that actually do the work for clients. So for people like designers, developers, copywriters, it's probably 100% of their salary. And then you're going to have those people in the organization that are kind of split between the two, right? Maybe you have the designer, but like maybe 25% of their time is like running the company website. Or you as a founder, maybe you're still doing 20, 30% of your time on delivery, and then the rest is running the business. So do the payroll allocations, do them based on a person's job description so they don't change every month. And that's a really important one that I'll come back to. And split payroll out, and then do the same thing for software. You probably have a bunch of software, and for most of you, it's going to be about 4 to 6% of your agency gross income is tied up in these kinds of expenses that are required for your delivery team to do their job, but are not just for one project. So this is like Figma, Adobe Creative Cloud, your stock footage libraries. Maybe you've got tools to like run ad testing or analytics for your clients, right? So those are like the tools in the toolbox that your team needs to go and do the job every day. And so those delivery expenses need to get isolated so that you can look at, okay, how much money did we bring into the business? And then what do we have to spend to get that actually into our bank account so we then could pay for our overhead and then get to a profit? So it's kind of like taxes, right? If you're trying to build wealth, first step is tax efficiency, because for most of you, hopefully all of you listening, you're paying a lot of taxes because you make a ton of money. Every dollar that you save on taxes, let's say your marginal rate is 40%, you just got a 40% return. Really hard to do that in investing on a consistent basis. It's the same thing for an agency. If it's costing you 60, 70 cents to earn a dollar, well, now you only have 30% of every dollar that comes into the business left to pay your overhead and have a profit. It's going to be really hard to do that. But if you're hitting the target, which is 50%, you want to try to not spend more than 50% of your revenue to earn it, or 50 cents to earn a dollar. Then you have 50% of every dollar left over. You'll probably spend between 20 and 30% of that on your overhead, which is three major categories: admin, sales and marketing, and then facilities. And again, you're trying to keep that to 20, 30-ish%. So that should leave you at least 20% left over. And if you can push that delivery margin up to 55, 60, 70%, now you can have really, really strong bottom line profit, not have to suffocate yourself at the overhead level, right? Make the investments you want to make there, pay yourself a reasonable salary as a founder, and still have a healthy profit margin left over. But everybody comes to me and it's like the symptoms at the doctor. They're like, oh, I think my problem is I spend $400 a month on a bookkeeper instead of two, or I'm using $200 a month version of the software instead of the $75 a month version of the software. It's like, that's not your problem. Your problem is that you're spending 65 cents to earn a dollar. So that's your problem. We need to fix that.
So quick recap, because I wasn't able to write as fast. So if I heard correctly, you're saying at a minimum, the delivery margin should be 50%. Ideally, obviously, that's higher.
Yep.
And then you said the other 20 to 30% is made up of, you said three things: admin, and then two other things.
Sales and marketing and facilities. And that's really your overhead. That's like the cost to run the business, you know?
Got it. Okay.
Got to pay for your lawyers, your accountants.
Yep.
You know, as a founder, most of your salary's there. You might have an admin assistant. You might have a salesperson. You might have an office, or if you're a remote team, you might give people home office stipends or co-working licenses, stuff like that, right? So all of that would kind of go into what most people would consider like OpEx. But the issue I see
Yeah.
most agencies have is they're like, okay, here's how much revenue we add, and then here's this other huge bucket of expenses, and there isn't a
Mhm.
separation. And that middle layer of delivery margin is critically important.
And so at a minimum, our delivery margin's 50. And even if those three things, admin, sales and marketing, and facility, end up being 30, we still have 20% left over.
That's right. That's pretty good.
That's pretty good. And so that for everybody would then be what everyone would be considered 20% net margin.
And that should be after you've paid yourself a market rate salary as a founder, right?
Yes, yes, yes.
That's probably six figures plus if you're
yeah.
a
So
$1 million
you as the
agency.
founder should be in that 20 to 30% as your salary is what you're saying.
Most of it, yeah, is likely to end up
Yeah.
there. It's going to depend on your size. Obviously, if you're a small
Right.
team, 5, 6 people, you're probably still doing some work, but there's going to be a good chunk of your salary that's in sales and marketing and admin.
Yep. Love it. Okay, cool. So maybe this is going to lead us into there, but you said the people look at OpEx and that number that kind of feels like it's not, doesn't belong anywhere is usually that delivery margin that they're not looking at specifically. And you're saying,
Yeah.
oh, it actually costs you 65 cents to make a dollar, which if you were to kind of take that and lead us into like, what are the top three biggest issues that you see agencies and service providers making that is killing their profitability?
Yeah, and I totally forgot that for those of you watching on video, I've got my iPad here and I can start to draw some stuff. So your observation, Greg, is astute. There are actually only three things that determine your delivery margin. So let's talk about what those are. First, let's talk about the formula for delivery margin. So let's talk about what is the framework here for delivery margin. So first and foremost, the formula for delivery margin is your agency gross income minus your delivery costs, which we just talked about, mostly payroll, some tools, divided by your agency gross income. I want to pause here and talk about AGI because I didn't really talk about that earlier. That is a simple but important concept. If you are an agency that does a lot of pass-through costs, so like maybe you're running ads for clients, but that ad spend runs through you, or you do big print campaigns, or you hire white label partners to do things like production, you want to strip all that revenue out because it doesn't belong to you. So you want to isolate your actual revenue, which is like what's left over after you've paid Facebook for the ads, after you've paid for the print budget, after you've sent a bunch of the money over the fence to the production company. That's what we want to measure everything relative to. So that's AGI, agency gross income. More information about that on our blog, but that's the formula. So in this example, if I had made $1 million, I spent $400,000 on delivery expenses, then I had a 60% delivery margin. So let's talk about what are the three things that impact delivery margin. One, which has to do with your delivery costs, and that's essentially your average cost per hour, ACPH. So for every hour that your team works, what is the average cost of that? So that is really looking at delivery costs. And so the real big TLDR on that is, can I get the same work done by people who cost less money? And this is where people start looking at offshoring. This is where people start looking at, building better processes and SOPs so that they can have more junior people that have lower judgment or less experience or less ability to handle ambiguity and less autonomous do the same work and get the same outcomes. But if that was easy, then everybody would just do that. And there's limits to how much efficiency you can gain from that. But that's door number one, right? If your delivery cost goes down, then the ratio between AGI and delivery costs has gone up. Therefore, you become more profitable. So that's option number one. Then the other two options that most of my clients find much more interesting is, well, how do we just get more AGI out of the current delivery costs that we're spending? How do we get our people to earn more revenue with the time that they already have? And there's two factors that influence that. The first is ABR, which stands for average billable rate. So for every hour that my team works, on average, how much revenue does that earn for the business? This is not to be confused with like the rate card that you have and like the number that you use to multiply the hours you think it's going to take. This is actually like when you look backwards and you say, okay, we earned 10 grand and it took us this many hours to do the work. What was the actual level of efficiency there? That's average billable rate. And then the third factor is the most misunderstood metric and the most misused metric in agency world, which is utilization, which is a measure of what is the amount of payroll that we spend money on that is being deployed towards doing things that earn us revenue, which could be really defined as getting deliverables done for clients. But more specifically, money earning activities, because then people might start to conflate this with like sales. That's like bringing in new business, but it's like once we've sold the thing, we have to get it done. That's the earning of the revenue. So that's really what
money
we're focused
earning.
on.
Yeah, money earning.
Yeah.
Got it.
So those are the three levers at your disposal to improve your delivery margin. We'll dig into this for a moment. Average cost per hour, really simple. Payroll, this is total payroll, fully loaded, the total cost to employ somebody divided by their capacity. And for most full-time employees, this is 2,080 hours per year. Now, most people will push back on this and say, well, Marcel, a person doesn't actually work 2,080 hours per year. They have weekends, they have holidays, paid time off, sick time. We have a foosball tournament every fourth Sunday in the office. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but do you really want to have to go and get all of those data points to do this calculation? No, probably not. And if we look at our formula for delivery margin, you'll see that cost reflected in your delivery margin on the P&L. So my argument here again is like precision versus accuracy. Let's go with the easy and accurate number instead of the precise one that's going to create a ton of operational drag. And just think about calculating your average cost per hour in this way. What does it cost for me to employ this person? Salary, benefits, all that stuff, divided by how many hours in a given time period did I purchase from them? And usually that's 40 hours per week for whatever amount of weeks you're looking at this on.
Yeah, so if you just said 40 hours a week times 52 weeks a year, that's 2,080. But most people get, typically you'll say 2 weeks vacation. Because I know a lot of people, when they do their effective hourly rate, they do it at 2,000 hours. Is that to account for 2 weeks vacation?
Yeah, and to be honest, like I don't think you should be trying to pull any of that stuff out. It just set the margin target. We'll talk about this, but
yeah,
average cost per hour.
This is super conservative. If anything, to go to 2,080, even if it's lower, it benefits you.
Well, yeah, so it's going to make your average cost per hour look lower, but then the question is just like, okay, well, we set the target for delivery margin to compensate for that loss of efficiency. So generally, the rule of thumb here is, and we'll talk about this in a moment, you can run the same formula for delivery margin on your average cost per hour versus your average billable rate. And the target there is going to be about a 70% margin if the goal is to hit 50 on the P&L. We want to add 10 to 15% to account for that inefficiency. So you just figure out what it is and you bake it in. So again, every week or every month or whatever period you're calculating this on, you don't have to go and grab how much vacation time does Johnny get versus Sally, and then, well, we changed our policy on this, and like all those variables, it just slows you down. So you can round the edges a little bit on this and just say, yeah, 2,080 per year divided by their total cost, that's their average cost per hour, and then that scales, really easily. So there's not a whole lot really to say on average cost per hour. The game here is lower that number. And you do that by finding cheaper people to do the same work. You do that by finding ways to offload work from your most expensive resources to your less expensive resources. That's really the game. So I won't spend too much time on average cost per hour. But one thing I will impress here is like, here's an example of how this number fluctuates. If I'm trying to hit a 70% margin and I'm paying somebody $120,000 per year, their average cost per hour is $57.69. So if I divide that by 0.30, which is like what I would need to make to get a 7% margin, I need to make $192 per hour in order to have that margin. If I get an intern to do all that same work and their cost per hour is $26 an hour, I only need to charge $88 an hour to make my 70% margin. And if those two people are blended together, it comes out to about 140. So you can see here that the amount of money you need to charge to hit a very healthy profit margin changes dramatically based on what your average cost to get that work done is. So it's an important lever, and it goes to show that like it doesn't actually matter how much you pay people. It matters what the delta is between how much they're getting paid and how much you could charge. So if you're in a market where you're very restricted or your positioning is not helping you, right? If you're constrained in terms of how much you can raise your prices, because of course, the first piece of advice people will get when they're not being profitable is you should raise your prices. And it probably is the first thing that they should do, but there is not an unlimited height to that ceiling at any given moment in time, right? So once you hit that ceiling, then the other thing to look at is, okay, well,
right,
can we adjust this cost? So that's average cost per hour. Let's talk about average billable rate next, which is the other side of this, right? How much money do you earn? And that formula is very simple. It's AGI divided by delivery hours. So you could look at the beautiful thing about this number is it's so inexpensive, right? You need two pieces of information. How much money did the client pay us? And then how many hours do we have to invest to get that work done? And with those two simple numbers, you can look at any time period, last week, last month, last year, last quarter, and then you can start to, if your data is structured properly, slice any area of the business by client, by service line, by product type, by team, right? If you've structured your time tracking and invoicing data, then you can start to look at very inexpensively and very frequently and compare these things to each other, start to see trends over time. And then if you have an understanding of your average cost per hour, you know kind of what the target needs to be. So this is a great proxy for delivery margin, but it doesn't have to go through your whole accounting system. So you could be looking at this every week if you wanted to, if your team's tracking time at that level. So average billable rate, this is the formula. So to give you an example, if I had $500,000 in revenue across, let's say my website projects last quarter, and it took 2,500 hours to get that work done, my average billable rate was $200 an hour. It doesn't matter if when I was estimating that project, I estimated it at 250 or at 150. The reality is it took me this much time and therefore my efficiency was $200 per hour. So that's average billable rate. And then again, just some examples here, and we see this all the time. It's like, I'll ask a client, hey, who's your most profitable client? And they would immediately say, well, the website build, $50,000 in AGI, 70K bill. But actually, no, it wasn't, because it took you 500 hours to do that work and your ABR was only $100. Whereas the smallest project on this list, the funnel build, yeah, we only had $10,000 in AGI come through for that, but we did it in 50 hours. So our average bill rate was $200 an hour. So if you think about this in terms of like, if we have a limited number of hours to sell, do I want to sell them for 100 or do I want to sell them for two? And that starts to
And
guide where we put that money.
and so this would be a case for, hey, like we should be doing more funnel builds, less website builds, maybe kill the website build service line.
Maybe. This is what I love about using this number is you can pull this report up every week, every month, after every project and put it in front of your team and just have the discussion. What can we learn from this? Is there an inefficiency in our process that we can fix that might bring this up, right? Is there a reason it's taking us 500 hours? And if you have next to this the estimate, and the estimate said 300 hours, but it actually took us 5, then you can get curious. Well, what happened? Oh, well, that design bounced back and forth between dev and design. It's like, okay, well, can we fix that process, right? Or, we didn't ask the client about this thing and then it came back to bite us in the ass later. Okay, well, we can learn from that. Or is it that we didn't charge enough? Or did we not scope it right? Or is it just that like, yeah, you know what, we're not very good at these website builds. Maybe we should stop doing them. I don't know the answer to this question, but bringing this up to your team is a very powerful way to start to get those answers and ultimately start to index towards either increasing this if there's an opportunity to do so, or just selling the stuff that's better and that makes you more money.
All right. So I have a question that I was going to hold for later, but now I have to ask because
Sure.
I don't want to forget, and B, maybe you can continue with kind of this as a lens too. So like a lot of our clients and myself included, right? Like there is a group element to what we do. And so like it's not one for one, like one guy, Ryan, on my team might be facilitating a coaching call, which is 1 hour of his time, but he's serving 25 clients at a time. Is that something that shows up here and or needs to be considered when you have more leveraged deliverables?
Yeah, the adjacent thing to this in a more traditional agency is roles like account management and project management, where like their day is going by in 5-minute increments across like all the clients in your business. And so it's very hard to attribute their cost to a single client or project. So the answer there is that you just kind of apply a level of abstraction. So instead of tracking time to, you have 25 clients on that call, you're not going to say, okay, well, that 1 hour, we're going to divide it by 25 and allocate that even. Like, that's kind of ridiculous. Instead, you would say, okay, well, that service line of this group coaching program or whatever, let's track time at that level. And then maybe you'd say, let's compare that to this other stuff that we do. And you might realize that it's far less profitable. But you're getting into now, like, you could argue that that's a different business model than running an agency. It kind of is. You're getting into productized services, coaching, information business. So this stuff is not necessarily built for that, but it can be adapted in that way. But typically what that means is you're just going to bring it up to a higher level of abstraction to account for the fact that there's just this massive increase of complexity that happens underneath that because there's a bunch of different clients involved in that one interaction.
Got it. Cool. Yeah. Carry on.
All right. So we've talked about average billable rate, how to calculate it, what this might look like on a report, and how this could be really useful to look at this information, right? Like looking at a report that tells you this information could really lead to some great conversations. And then finally, as I mentioned before, the delivery margin formula, you could use it on your average billable rate and then use this as a proxy for delivery margin. So if you know that, hey, my average cost per hour in the website department is X, then I know that if I achieve Y ABR, I'm probably right around this delivery margin. So this is just a really nice, inexpensive way to get very fast and precise at getting a pulse on your delivery margin without having to go through all the rigmarole and expensive increasing the complexity of your accounting system. So we've talked about average cost per hour. We've talked about ABR. Now let's talk about utilization, the dark saber of agency metrics, the thing that everybody seems to get wrong and uses. Yeah, right. It has great power, but can do great damage. So the formula for utilization, this is the first place that it starts to break down. When I do stakeholder interviews at big agencies and I ask all the managers, hey, tell me exactly how you calculate utilization. They'll usually get this part right. Oh, it's somebody's capacity divided by, the number of billable hours or delivery hours that they work. It's like, cool. Well, what exactly is somebody's capacity? That's where it starts to break down. Does it include, vacation time, paid time off, whatever? What about working on the company website? Is that a billable hour? Is that a delivery hour? And the answer to this question from my perspective is utilization as a pure metric. If we think about what's the purpose of that, it's understanding how much of all the payroll that we spent in a given time period or area of the business went towards earning us revenue. So capacity is the same as average cost per hour. It's all of the time that we bought. And if somebody's taking vacation time or there's holidays or we want to give everybody a Friday a month off or whatever, we need to see that cost reflected in utilization because it's lowering it. So don't strip all that out. That's a separate metric called delivery utilization, which we'll talk about in a second. But this metric is utilization. And so we want everyone's entire capacity. And if you're looking at the whole business, you include the people that don't do any client work in this. So you got a salesperson that's 0% utilized, put them in here, because otherwise you're also not going to see the cost of the balance of your team being, good or bad. And I've had some clients that, they're like, hey, our utilization's great. I don't understand why we're not profitable. And then we zoom out and it's like, well, the maximal utilization for your whole business is like 40% because you're top heavy. You got a whole bunch of people that you're paying for that don't actually earn revenue for the business. So like that balance should probably be 50 to 60% if you want to have a good shot at being profitable, or your average billable rate needs to go way up to help pay for that. You're allowed to make that decision. I had a client, they want to do a 4-day work week. So it was like, okay, well, you're allowed to do that, but how much more do you have to charge your clients so they can subsidize that? Otherwise, you're going to pay for it out of your profits, right? So this is utilization. This is the formula. It doesn't have to be any more complicated than that. And again, delivery hours. I use the word delivery hours because billable hour has a connotation that it matters if you build the client for it or not. And it doesn't, right? Because if you run a time materials shop, I'm sure you've had instances where it's like, well, we billed the client for like 100 hours, but then we kind of had to do 20 for free because we messed something up. So it actually took you 120 hours to do that work. So that's the number of delivery hours. The billable hours might be 100, but those two things are not always exactly the same. So that's the nuance there. What matters with delivery hours is, did you have to do it to get this thing done? It doesn't really matter if it changed the price for the client or not. So your utilization is that.
How often do you see that the example you just gave, like, hey, you build 100, but you actually gave 20 for free because you guys messed something up, so it's actually 120. How often is this like the main culprit of profitability, is just people don't understand that they're quote unquote over delivering? Maybe this is like the scope creep or scope seep examples.
Most of the time, I would say probably 65% of the time, that's the first priority, is that their average billable rate is substantially lower than what they think it is. And in terms of prioritization, like, I would rather increase my average billable rate first, even if it means my utilization is going to go down. That's a better situation to be in. Like, our average billable rate's strong, but now we have all this extra capacity. So I could do two things about that. I could lay people off and then we're just more profitable instantly, or I could go sell more stuff and not have to hire any additional people. So I like optimizing for average billable rate first and then utilization second. A much harder situation is where super utilized and our average billable rate sucks. Well, that's a problem because now we have to start to like really dramatically decrease the amount of time that goes into our clients. And if you have retained clients, that might mean like they're used to a certain level of service. We're having to try to walk that back. So maybe you have to make that adjustment by just replacing clients for a long period of time until all the new clients just have a higher level of efficiency. So it's just a longer process and it's more painful to go through. So yeah, I usually it's average billable rate, and generally we focus on that first and then utilization second because it's just an easier path and a faster path. So the formula for utilization. So yeah, in this example, if I'm under my target, I have two levers that I can pull. I can reduce my capacity. That means getting rid of people in the business, or I can sell more stuff. It's really that simple. This is how you control utilization. But the mistake I see a lot of people make here with utilization is they say, oh shit, our utilization is low. I'm going to go tell my team, hey, I need you at 65% utilization. The problem with that is if you haven't given them more work to do, but now you're holding them accountable to this metric that they actually have zero control over. What's Greg going to do if I'm like, hey, Greg, I need you at 65%, or I'm going to berate you in front of your peers on our next team meeting about being below your target? Well, if you only have 40% worth of work to do, you're going to just make the logo bigger and smaller until you get to 65%, or you'll just lie on your timesheet, right? You're incentivized to do that. Does that benefit the company at all? Well, no, it's lowering our average billable rate. We don't know how long it actually takes us to do stuff. So I don't believe that it's ever a good idea to use utilization as a metric that your whole team is held accountable to. That's a metric you're held accountable to, your sales team is held accountable to, and maybe your project management resource planning team is accountable to, because it has to do with, did you give your team enough work to do? Did you right size the team to the amount of work that you have? And did you resource plan properly? Your team doesn't control how much work you bring into the business. They just control what they're told to do. And if they're not doing what they're told to do, that's a performance management issue. But arbitrarily holding the team accountable to utilization does not actually benefit the business in any way. And it leads to bad timesheet compliance and kind of undermines this whole effort. So that's a bit of a soapbox that you could tell I've gotten on a few times, but I had to say that here.
Totally. Oh, man. So in order to improve utilization, it's reduce capacity or sell more, period.
That's it. Those are the two levers that you have, because the
Cool.
formula is just two elements. So let's talk about targets, because everybody wants to know what are the targets, and most people get this wrong. There's a difference between a regular week and an annual target, because again, based on this formula, people are going to have vacation time, paid time off, etc. So on a regular week, pure producers generally 75% plus is what we see. So that's 30 to maybe 34, 36 on a very high end hours per week out of 40 that you want them doing stuff that is productive for the business. That number will be lower the more diluted your producers are across multiple clients. So if you have a developer that gets to work on one project for 6 months at a time, not uncommon for them to be 90% plus utilized. But if that developer has to jump around between 6 different clients all the time, they're going to be far less efficient. So they'll probably be down closer to 75%. Delivery managers, this would be like your creative director or like a senior developer that's managing the team but then also doing a little bit of client work. They'll be lower. Anything above 35% is pretty good. And then anyone else, that's not billable, anything above 0% is a bonus. The important thing is that on a weekly basis, so 40 hours, no vacations, no holidays, a normal week, you should be able to get to around 65% plus. And then when you look at the annual targets, you usually want to subtract, again, 10 to 20% from that target. So in this case, as an example, pure producers, you want them to be able to net out at the end of the year. So out of 2,080, how many delivery hours did they log? 60% plus, delivery managers, 20% plus, and the whole agency, when you include everybody, should be able to get over 50% utilization. That's kind of the standard benchmark. Again, if you want that to be lower, that's a choice you're allowed to make, but understand you have to charge more money to pay for that. Otherwise, it's just going to come out of your bottom line.
Why would you want that lower?
Lifestyle, right? Like some people want to have a 4-day work week. Some people want to give their team a lot of work-life balance, and that's becoming much more popular. But understand again that there's a cost to it, right? If you want to be the cool parent that lets your team go home at noon on Friday, that cost needs to be accounted for somewhere else. Either they get paid less, so your average cost per hour goes down, or you need to charge more, so your average billable rate goes up.
So if you're accounting for lifestyle type stuff, the utilization obviously number will go down. It would seem that you also wouldn't want like 100% utilization.
Yes. Yeah. And
Is
that, man, we used to see that all the time, right? People expecting 40 billable hours a week. It's like what you're really saying is you expect your team to work 50 or 60 hours a week, which is not what your employment contract says. So, yeah, that is not good. And especially in 2022, you're going to have a hard time attracting and retaining talent. You're running that playbook. And the problem is that historically, that's how a lot of agencies actually made their money. If you think about it, like it used to be that you'd go to an agency, you get paid like crap, and everybody just worked 80 hours a week. So if you work 80,
Dude,
but
I
you're
used
getting
to
paid for
sleep.
40,
I would sleep there.
yeah,
Like I slept there. There were times throughout the year where we didn't even sleep. We were there all night. There was one shower that like was basically off the CEO's thing. And he's like, if anyone's working overnight, feel free to use it. Like,
yeah.
dude, the number of times I used that, and I was making like 35K a year, like right out of college. 80 was like a good week.
Yeah. So unless your recruitment strategy is like going out onto the street and finding, people that have no means of taking care of themselves and they're desperate for their next dollar, which designers, developers, the talent that we're trying to get after, that is not the case anymore. So it's
Right.
an employees market right now, and you can't get away with that. But the reason that worked was if you didn't scope the project well and you had to put an extra 100 hours into it, who's paying for that? The employees paid for it, not the managers. Their average cost per hour just went down. Their salary stayed the same, but they worked twice as many hours. So we were just letting employees subsidize this stuff. In 2022, you can't get away with that. You now have to be accountable as the owner to running the business well, because your team is not going to put up with that and subsidize your mistakes anymore. So
Yeah, yeah.
that's the reality. We got to get serious about this stuff.
Totally. Dude, amazing.
Okay, so utilization. I just want to drive this home with an example. This is
Perfect.
why this is so powerful. And I really believe that if you only looked at utilization and ABR and understood what your targets needed to be, you could run the whole business on those two numbers. If I have 10,000 hours of capacity, and let's assume for these examples that the payroll is the same, the overhead cost for the business is the same. At a 50% utilization and a $100 average billable rate, this team is capable of earning $500,000 in a given time period. If I increase that rate to 125, I spend a little less time, I increase my rates a little bit. Now that same team can make $625,000 in the same time period. And if I keep that rate at 125 and I go from 50 to 60% utilization, that same team is now earning $750,000 in AGI. So that's a 50% increase. None of my costs have changed. That could be the difference between losing money and being very profitable. And it's just from pulling those two levers. The same team with the same cost basis is now earning a substantially higher amount of revenue because they're just more efficient at it. That's the power of these two numbers. Most people don't realize, like, wow, these are not
Yeah.
big tweaks, but the impact is substantial. I mean, that's basically it. So you've got three levers essentially to influence your delivery margin. What does it cost for an hour of time? How much money do you make for an hour of time? And then how much of your payroll is being spent earning that revenue? That's it.
So can you give, and you sort of did this, but to like, I think tie this home to put a bow on it. Like, what are a couple things someone would do to go from the 100 to 125 and then from the 50 to the 60?
Yeah. So let's start with average billable rate. So basically two mechanisms if we come back to the formula for ABR. ABR is AGI divided by delivery hours. So what are your two levers? Number one, charge more money for the same thing without changing the scope. Or number two, spend less time to do the same amount of work, right? So maybe you build some tech, you build some templates, you build a better process, whatever that is, you innovate on the service offering, you charge the same amount of money, but you spend less time, or you do both. And, this year we had a service offering where we took the price from 3 to 7K and we took the amount of time it takes us to do it from 40 down to 23 hours. So we pulled two levers, dramatically improved the ABR of that service offering. So that's ABR, how to improve that.
Love
and then
it.
around utilization, the two levers for utilization, as you remember, capacity versus delivery hours. So tactically, what this means is usually there's a resource planning gap. So like, are you really, really tight about resource planning? Is your team, like project manager, delivery manager, really on top of understanding who's busy, who's not, who's got capacity, who's not? A lot of times what we see here is within a design team, maybe there's 4 designers. There's one of them that's just doing way more work than everybody else because there's like a skill set gap where like they're the only one that knows how to do this thing. And so there could be like a training. So there's nuanced opportunities here, but at its core, how you improve your utilization is usually team composition. You have a higher ceiling for delivery hours. So you might be top heavy, make some adjustments there. You might have too low of a target for some people, make some adjustments there. Figure out ways to get them out of internal meetings, spend less time on administrative stuff, right? Like allocate more of their time towards delivery and fill that time with client work, or just do a better job of forecasting and resource planning so you know when to right size your team. And one of the tricks here is one of the easy ways to close this gap is to introduce elasticity to your capacity. And that's a really fancy way to say use contractors and white label partners that you don't have to pay when you're not busy. And I think about this like with an agency, there's kind of a tide that rises over time. So in the early days, any fluctuation in client work is going to be like pretty noticeable, right? This is like day zero of your agency. So I love for a new agency, start with all contractors. So you don't have to stress. You don't have to sell stuff that sucks because you got to make payroll. You can always sell like a cat, not a dog, because you're not beholden to payroll. But over time, as you get bigger, that tide is going to rise and the waves will still exist, but they'll be up at the top of the water, So you can start to hire full-time employees for this portion that has some certainty and then maintain elasticity up here where there's still some volatility. So I like having like a seawall, if you will, of elastic resources to help absorb that fluctuation so it doesn't start to cut into my utilization. So that's kind of a ninja trick. It's not really a ninja trick, it's common sense, but I just like to make it sound like it's a lot fancier than it is with
No, I think it's overlooked. I think it's overlooked. Like, and I'd probably make this mistake and or have made the mistake for sure. It's like you feel like, oh, well, I need this person full time. And it actually creates some of that stress that you probably are feeling because now you're trying to, support this full-time person. And when those waves are going, like you feel it when the tide is low.
Yeah, 100%. And data can really help take a lot of the guesswork out of this, right? If you're good at scoping work, if the way you scope work is aligned to the way that you resource plan, then you could start to project that out into the future. You could start to measure utilization and see how volatile is utilization in these different departments of the business. And that can start to inform decisions about where do I keep elasticity, where do I take it off? And then similarly, if I could see, okay, my utilization or the amount of hours we spend on freelance designers is consistently like 25, 30 a week, then it's like, okay, well, that would mean that my full-time designer would be pretty well utilized. Let's make that higher. Like, this doesn't have to be guesswork. The data can tell you all of this.
So my last question then goes to the data, right? Like, I mean, I'm sure people listening to this and or watching this are like, I don't have any of this data. A decent amount seems to start with like tracking time.
Yeah.
So what's the recommendation for introducing that? And are there specific tools that you recommend and or is that what you guys do?
Yeah, so of course, like, we probably both heard this from the source, but like my thesis is your marketing should serve more people than your product ever does. So my objective is to give the information away for free for people to be able to do this without hiring us. But a lot of people choose to hire us because this stuff is not actually very easy when you get to the weeds. So on that note,
Hmm.
if you want to go and take a
Yes.
mini course on how to set all this stuff up and measure this stuff and get some templates and toolkits and training videos, head to parakeeto.com/toolkit and check that out. And that's like what you need to just get the basics in place, some high level
Love it.
principles. To talk about this a little bit more, there's a basic principle here, and this is like a thing that gets overlooked so much, is in order to get a feedback loop here and for this data to be useful, it needs to be structured deliberately. So if you're listening, you've maybe had this experience. You have an estimate for your project, and the estimate
Hmm.
says like, okay, we have a client, we have a project, and then we have this many design hours, this many PM hours, this many developer hours, and then you go into your time tracking data, if you have any, and you just have like a billion random tasks, and it's not clear what role category that even goes back into. So there was just this gap where it's like you set up the time tracking, but you never really thought about like, well, what question is this helping us answer? And the most fundamental one is, did what we think was going to happen actually happen? So the first step that's going to solve 80% of your problems is just create alignment between how you estimate work and how you track time. And then the tools that you use for that, I get asked this question all the time: what's the best time tracking tool? Well, we look at them from the back end. I can tell you right now, the APIs are basically the same for all 10 million of the time tracking tools you have to choose from. The best one is the one your team uses, because without compliance, your time tracking data is not helpful. So keep it simple and focus on the thing that has low friction that your team's going to use. Consider your workflow. Start with a very simple structure, but get these two things aligned. Some things that I'm a fan of, because you asked the question, I will give you the answer. We see a lot of Harvest. I'm a fan of Harvest. I think it's great. We've had good success with Timely, with EverHour, Toggle. I have mixed feelings about. The UI is pretty good, but there are some workflow considerations that are difficult to enforce compliance unless you pay for their more expensive plan. And then ClickUp can be good for time tracking. I like them for project management, but the curse of fully integrated project management and time tracking is that it can add a lot of friction to the time tracking process, because now you have to go find the task that you need to track time against, and then you're constraining your project management structure with your time tracking structure. And if those two things are in conflict with one another, it makes sense to separate them and then maybe create a bridge with like a task ID, so you can enrich a time entry in like a secondary way. So you can see that this gets very
Yeah.
advanced, but it
Yeah.
doesn't
Yeah.
have to be. The simple starting point is just like set up your time tracking tool so that if you estimate client project roles, the time tracking tool is client project role. Start there and you'll get 80% of the way to where you need to go.
I love it. Dude, thank you so much. This is super useful and helpful, guys. If, like he said, if you want to get that free toolkit, go to parakeeto.com/toolkit. We'll make sure that's linked up in the description and the show notes. Marcel, man, thanks. We're going to have to get you to come do like an actual workshop to our clients.
Well, I'll connect you to my agent and they'll aggressively negotiate. I'm just kidding, Greg. No, I'd love that. This has been a pleasure. I hope that this was helpful for everyone listening. And if it was, connect with me on LinkedIn, reach out. If you have questions, let me know. I just want to help agencies figure this out because I just know how hard it is. I've been through trying to figure all this stuff out on my own, and it sucks. So yeah, just let me know if I can be helpful, and thanks for listening.
Thanks, man.